Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and it's time for our Throwback Thursday episode for this week. This time we're switching it up a bit and giving you our top 5 picks for the best fighter games from back in the day. Welcome back to the video, and like the introduction mentioned, it's Throwback Thursday time. Now before we start the picks, I just want to remind everyone that this is not the best 5 fighter games, but my personal pick for my favorite 5 fighter games I played prior to the current gen titles. This list will probably be different from a lot of yours. If it is, I would love to hear about the games you would pick, so please drop down and put them in the comments. Now let's get into the list. And number 5. Primal Rage. I'll be honest, when I first planned to make this video, I had completely forgotten about Primal Rage. I only recalled it while doing my research for this video, but doing so instantly filled me with nostalgia of sitting on my bed and playing it as a teenager. I had originally planned on putting something like Bloody Roar 2 or maybe even Clay Fighter in this spot. I know none of these 3 would generally make others' favorites list, and certainly not a best 5 list, but when it comes down to it, there was something about Primal Rage that simply satisfied me. Primal Rage was an arcade game that was ported to many platforms, even though the programmers coded some unique securities which has prevented a true emulation from being created even to this day. I personally played it on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and I didn't even know it was available on the original Sony PlayStation. The game does present its own story as to why your characters have to fight. Essentially, a massive meteor strike hits the planet, destroying life as we knew it and sending us back to the Stone Age. From below the surface of Earth emerges 7 fearsome creatures which mankind worship as gods. These creatures are divided on 2 sides, one which wishes to keep the peace and the other wants to plunge the world into further chaos. When it comes to gameplay, for the most part, the game follows other 2-dimensional fighter games of that same time. A standard multiplayer feature and a single-player campaign in which the player faces off against the other creatures 1 vs 1 in an increasingly difficult path. One of the truly unique features that set Primal Rage apart from the other fighter games of the time was how worshippers of the gods would appear at the bottom of the screen during fights. The players could eat these worshippers to increase their health. The game included special attacks and fatalities. One fatality caused a slight controversy when a woman complained to the media that her 11-year-old son who had played the game witnessed the Chaos character perform his Golden Shower fatality. The game was re-reviewed by the ESRB and determined that the appropriate teen rating was already applied to the game and that the kid, not being a teenager, should have never been allowed to play it. Even though the game only had 7 characters to choose from, it was still pretty cool to play as these primal beasts. It was just something different from the other fighter games that mostly featured humanoid characters. I really enjoyed playing as Vertigo, the half-cobra, half-dinosaur goddess of insanity. One thing I think the game really missed on was with the final round of the single-player game. It was originally planned to have a boss, which I think they should have went with, but instead was scrapped in favor of an endurance round against all the other characters you had just defeated. I think they also could have played up the story a little better here. They could have utilized the good vs evil theme on the single-player campaign if they had a deeper roster. A 12-character roster where you would go through the 6 characters on the opposing faction and then face off against that faction's unplayable boss would have been awesome. At any rate, the game is still good as it was delivered, and I think maybe underrated when it comes to 2D fighters. Number 4. Sciuto Blade 2. Sciuto Blade 2 was by far the most unique versus fighter game I had ever played. It was released on the original Sony PlayStation at a time when I had moved on from really enjoying fighting games and was much more into RPGs. However, the game was published by Squaresoft, the same RPG publishing giant that pushed out all-time greats in the Final Fantasy series on the same Sony PlayStation. It was a time when just the name Squaresoft on the CD cover was all I needed to see in order for me to want to try the game. This game in particular was one that I played with a friend of mine, Screen Tapper, who you see on our Gallows Inn Tavern Talk show, and we simply loved it. We were both into Squaresoft, and he was even more so into the Japanese culture which the game centers its plot on. Two rival samurai schools are waging war against each other. One has stolen a special sword from the other, so we're pitted in the middle of this old-fashioned Japanese feud. So throughout the story mode, you work your way through some unique level designs while dispatching random ninjas. After taking care of enough of these ninjas, you face off against one of the actual characters. I never really cared too much for the story mode. What I really enjoyed was the versus combat with a friend. The combat system in Sciuto Blade 2 was much more unique than other fighter games. Where other games relied on button mashing, combos, and fatalities, Sciuto Blade 2 had a more realistic approach. There was no life meter, no round timer, no special energy bars. You simply connected with one good blow from the weapon of your choice to defeat your enemy. There was no running out the clock or relying on some gimmick to win the match. There were non-lethal blows. If you were able to connect with an opponent's arm, then you would render that limb useless, thus limiting the attacks they could perform. It's a feature I wish first-person shooters could incorporate to this day. Realistic programming to know what part of the body was hit and how that would affect you instead of just implementing a health system. The game also featured some unique level design. Some stages were multi-tiered and had obstacles which added strategy to the gameplay. Having the high ground could mean all the difference between life and death. The game did suffer, however, from the technology of its time. Making a 3D fighter on the PlayStation resulted in graphics and animations akin to the first Tomb Raider that aged poorly in contrast to the 2D games on this list. A lack of music and generic voiceovers are noticeable.
You're going to fight?
You're Tatsumi, aren't you? I'm Chihiro, don't forget!
But at the end of the day, the unique and enjoyable gameplay was all I needed to consider Sciuto Blade 2 a classic, and the only game on this list I never actually owned. Number 3. Eternal Champions. It has baffled me that in my research for this video and all the other lists I read for best fighters, that I rarely see Eternal Champions even get mentioned. Where other fighter games at the time were successful arcade games that got ported to home console, Eternal Champions was developed by Sega specifically for the Master Drive and Genesis home consoles. Sticking with being unique, the developers attempted to lean heavily on the story instead of just raw gameplay. The thing is, I don't really even know if this worked. The story is that a being known as the Eternal Champion has predicted humanity will come to an end due to the untimely deaths of 9 important figures. So he decides to kidnap them from their time right before their death and have them face off in a tournament. The winner gets to be rescued from the death that fate had served them, while the other 8 get in a DeLorean and hit 88 miles per hour to go right back to where they were plucked from time to live out the original death. That is a pretty sketchy story to attempt to sell. It would leave one thinking, why not just save all 9 of them if you have that power? I mean, the game also sells that all 9 characters are inherently good, instead of some being good and some being evil. Sega also attempted to make an in-depth background for each character, but those storylines also leave a lot of room for plot holes. Take Trident, for example, an Atlantis merman with one hand who has mastered Brazilian dance fighting before it was ever created. I can appreciate what they were striving for, but the story just doesn't quite land. So I'm sure you're asking, with all the griping about the game, why would you put the game on your list? The simple matter of it was likely due to the fact that I played this game with my cousin when we were about 10 years old. As a 33-year-old adult and going back and researching the game, the holes in the story seem gaping. But as a 10-year-old, I didn't even notice them. Take the same example of Trident. At 10 years old, I probably just thought, oh sweet, check out this green dude with the pitchfork hand. Where most fighter games felt button mashy in that you could pick any of the characters and for the most part get the same core moves, Eternal Champions was just different. Trying to master each character and learn what they could do, what they were good at, and what their flaws were made the game more interesting to me. It almost felt like an RPG fighter of a game in that sense. Another cool thing was how Eternal Champions decided to incorporate their take on finishing moves. Where other games tied their finishers to the character, this game tied them to the character's stage. So where you may play through another fighter's single-player campaign performing the same finishing move level after level, Eternal Champions allowed you to experience a new finisher on each stage you were on. If that weren't enough to keep me personally happy, the game delivered on one big thing those of you who follow this channel know I put a huge emphasis on: the music. Again, each character's stage had its own music, and it's pretty well done in the sense that it matches the stage you're on. The music was so good that DJ u-neek sampled the main theme for use in Bone Thugs and Harmony's song appropriately titled Eternal.
Now, pal, pulling their body underground, put them in the ground, they lay way down. Clear, stay down. I'm one of the thuggest motherfuckers in your city, and if it's strap back, ride, ready, bit tap tap, in broad daylight. You with me, roll to the bone, don't hit that hydro. That's well I would bear, that's well I would sell. Well, I really keep that high on my mind, ride to the dogs that feel the darkness. He's 99, mind the thugs, I love some holy shit.
Bone was one of my favorite hip-hop groups, being that I was from Ohio, so it was really cool to see someone make a song with video game music at that time. To this day, that album, East 1999 Eternal, remains one of my favorite full albums of all time, and Eternal is my favorite track on it. As an added bonus, DJ u-neek again sampled another song from Eternal Champions for the same album. This time taking a piece from the Bad Ending credits song on the game and using it on the original Crossroads song on the album.
Even though you're gone, you still got love, my nigga, just rest your soul. Even though you're gone, you still got love, my nigga, just rest your soul. Even though you're gone, you still got love, my nigga, just rest your soul. Even though you're gone, you still got love, my nigga, just rest your soul. I never get up when some nigga tell me.
Number 2. Killer Instinct. I don't even need to talk about the story, gameplay, or graphics of Killer Instinct. I could simply cue up the intro music for this game and drop the mic. Seriously, when it came to fighter games, none of them got me more amped to play the game based on the title music than what Killer Instinct did. This game's intro song is the entire inspiration of this week's Throwback Thursday video. When I was making last week's video for Skitchin, I plugged another user's YouTube video for their cover of that soundtrack. At that time, I saw that they had also covered the intro theme for Killer Instinct, which instantly hit me with nostalgia so bad I wanted to make a video about that game. But I don't feel there's enough content in fighter games for me to be able to do so. So instead, I decided on a top 5 video you're watching now. As an added bonus, while writing this section, I went and listened to the theme of the games and found another YouTube user who created an excellent cover. I think you should check it out, so see it up in the top right hand corner info card. When it comes to gameplay, Killer Instinct follows much of the same formula the other 2D fighters of its time did. One thing that was a bit more unique to the game was the life system. Where most games at the time were a best 2 out of 3 system, Killer Instinct gave each player 2 life bars. When a player's life bar was depleted, the game would reset the players at a starting position to resume the fight, but the player whose life bar had not been depleted would remain at the same level. So both players in total were allotted the same total amount of HP. The game also incorporated finishing moves like its competitor of the time, Mortal Kombat. Although the finishing moves of Killer Instinct were brutal, they did not reach the level of violence that Mortal Kombat did. Killer Instinct was also highly driven by its combo system, which is computer assisted as opposed to needing to be fully controlled by user input. One of the most satisfying in the game was pulling off a massive combo followed by a finishing move known as an Ultra Combo. It, however, was just as satisfying interrupting the opponent's combo and hearing the sound cue. While the game featured plenty of characters with their own story, the storyline of the game itself was nothing new. Ultratech hosts a tournament. That's pretty much enough said. I personally never purchased this game specifically. When I did the first Throwback Thursday video covering The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, I talked about it being the reason I bought a Super Nintendo. However, the Super Nintendo that I did purchase came bundled with the limited edition black cartridge Killer Instinct. Needless to say, it was a very pleasant surprise. I spent a lot of time playing the game, and the cast of characters was so deep that it remained fresh on the shelf longer than most fighters for me. Cinder was personally my favorite character, as pulling off massive combos seemed to just come naturally with him. Number 1. Mortal Kombat Trilogy. I know that feeling you probably have right now. What happened to Street Fighter 2? Look, any list you come across will generally herald Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat 2 in the number 1-2 spots. For Street Fighter, I simply never played those games. I vaguely recall seeing my friend Screen Tapper play one of them, but it was so vague I don't even recall which one it was. Tekken is another praised franchise missed on this list, again simply because I didn't play it. As for Mortal Kombat 2, it was originally what I planned on putting at the number 1 spot on this list, but after thinking about it, Trilogy was my favorite fighter game of all time and the one I would play right now if I wanted to play an old school fighter. I really dislike when you read a top games list and the writer lists multiple games at the same spot. For example, if I wrote a top 10 action game from the PS3, all 3 Uncharted games would make that list for me, but they would each have to hold their own individual spot. It really gets under my skin when a writer groups them together like they're the same game, when all they're really trying to do is squeeze more games into their list. I'm going to explain why listing Mortal Kombat Trilogy is not the same thing. Also, it is important to note that I am talking about this game specifically as a PlayStation Greatest Hits version. It's the only one I played, and I have found some key differences in the release on other platforms, most notably the N64 one. First off, the game's first and biggest problem was the name they gave the game, Trilogy. That would lead you to believe the game is simply Mortal Kombat 1 through 3. I personally think they should have just named the game Mortal Kombat 4, but perhaps they had already started a project with that name underway. At its core, Trilogy is like a finely polished Mortal Kombat 3. After all the updates and patches to Mortal Kombat 3, you now have the skeleton of what Mortal Kombat Trilogy will be. To throw some guts on that skeleton, they essentially added most of the characters from Mortal Kombat 1 and 2, including previously unplayable ones and bosses. So at this point you're probably still thinking, Mortal Kombat Trilogy is just Mortal Kombat 1 through 3. If they had stopped there, then this would be a trilogy and not something I would consider its own game. But they added much more. A lot of the characters receive new abilities and finishing moves. A new aggressor meter that builds up as you fight. When the meter is full, the fighter receives a speed and strength boost for a short time. The game also added a completely new character named Chameleon, who was playable by selecting any of the male ninja characters and entering a button combination. Chameleon was a male ninja who would randomly change color palettes to any of the normal male ninjas and have that ninja's abilities while in that color. This actually, and probably without intention, added a new game mode to the game. Playing as Chameleon was one of my favorite things to do, because I really liked the ninja characters and this added a spontaneity to your gameplay. You had to adjust on the fly to whichever ninja he changed to, and I just found it really enjoyable. They also added in a whole new type of finisher with the introduction of brutalities. All of these reasons are why Trilogy is its own game. It checks off all the boxes and adds just as much to Mortal Kombat 3 as what 3 did to 2 and what 2 did to 1. For my money, they could have simply named it Mortal Kombat Massive Content. As for the graphics and music and sound, there's not much to speak of. There's not a whole lot changed since Mortal Kombat 2 in this area, and maybe they could have taken advantage to do so. Personally, I'm fine with where the graphics and sound are. I think it allowed the gameplay to deliver the new feeling, while graphics and sound retained the nostalgia in a time when 3D was becoming more of the standard. I think the most common negative remark I've seen others list on their review is being lost in the massive amount of content and the difficulty of this game. I'm not sure why a lot of content is a bad thing, especially when that content is primarily a large roster of characters. Nothing forces you to play them all. I don't see why having more of an option is considered a negative to some. As for the difficulty, I bought this game on PlayStation as a greatest hit, so it was probably around 2000 and I was like 15 or 16 years old. I don't recall it ever feeling frustratingly difficult. I think this has to speak to how games were moving more into a casual atmosphere and others are expecting a handheld walkthrough. I don't know, for me I have nothing but fond memories of it, and I played it 99% on my own in single player, as opposed to all the other fighter games on this list where I mostly enjoyed the versus mode. I guess each person has what they like and what they don't like, which is why building a list like this the way I did is so much fun. A list of games that I don't claim are the best, but left me with the best memories of enjoyable gameplay when it comes to old school fighter games. Well, that's it for the video, guys. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider giving the video a like. If you have thoughts on this game or on the series, please leave them in the comments below. Also, please subscribe and turn on the bell notification icon so you get alerted whenever we go live or upload new content. Until next time, I'm Sandsawks.